Is that the motion be agreed to? I call the honourable member Charles Chauvel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, for people listening to the House on the radio or watching on TV or on demand or sitting in the gallery, this bill might seem a strange thing to have appear on the order paper, and it might be worth just saying a few words about it. The Minister said in her first reading speech that these annual subordinate legislation, confirmation and validation bills tend to deal with matters that are uncontroversial. They're consulted about with the opposition in advance of the introduction of the bill to ensure that there aren't matters of controversy. And as the Minister pointed out, they exist because on occasion Parliament makes laws that allow delegated legislation to be made that has a sunset clause in it, because the executive is conscious of the need to bring the subject matter of the order back to the House for consideration as to whether the powers taken under the principal legislation remain necessary for the administration of the particular regime that was set up by the relevant legislation. And while it's true that this is a non-controversial bill, it is worth considering the sort of matters that the legislation brings to the House. There's the legislation, the delegated legislation, that prohibits trout from being imported into New Zealand. There's the legislation, the delegated legislation that prohibits the export of live cattle for slaughter, something that's very topical, for example, particularly in Australia at the moment, where there are huge concerns around the animal welfare issues that live exports, for example, to Indonesia are now causing. There's the delegated legislation that allows for the automatic increase in tobacco excise, ditto alcohol excise. There's orders in the bill which relate to the export of so-called dual-use material, scientific material that could be used in the manufacture of weapons such as nuclear weapons. And then, of course, there's a reference to the New Zealand, Hong Kong, China Closer Economic Partnership Agreement order. Very similar legislation in Australia is also very topical at the moment. That's the particular treaty under which a tobacco company seeks to sue the Australian government in an international legal forum to prevent it from proceeding with its proposal to plain package tobacco products on the domestic market in Australia. Very, very similar provisions in that treaty as between Australia and Hong Kong and between New Zealand and Hong Kong. So it's worth not minimising the issues that these subordinate legislation, confirmation and validation bills bring to the House. I think it's worth, though, raising a question about whether this is a good way to legislate. Is it a good use of the scarce time that the House has to allow for up to a 2-hour debate on a matter such as this every year, when we all know that there are other urgent matters that could be dealt with that are just sitting there on the order paper languishing? So by my calculations, we have 17 more sitting days until we run into the scheduled valedictories, the 16 valedictory speeches that have already been scheduled in this term of the Parliament by the Business Committee. So is it a good idea from the point of view of parliamentary procedure to force onto the order paper every year this sort of bill for a debate of this nature? Or could we do better? The Minister made a kind reference to the Regulations Review Committee, which I've had the good fortune to chair in this term. She said she was sure that the committee would give the bill careful scrutiny, and we'll do our best. But let me tell you, sir, a little bit about the scrutiny that we can, in practice, give this sort of measure, because we've done it twice already in this Parliament. What we do is we write to the relevant departments responsible for the administration of each measure in the validation legislation, and we say, do you still need these powers? And invariably they write back and they say, yes, we do. We'd quite like to keep them, thank you. And we say, right. And then we report it back to we report the bill back to the House, and we say the departments that are responsible for this legislation would like to keep the powers that they already have. It appears to us that that seems unobjectionable, and therefore we recommend to the House that this bill be passed. That is the level of scrutiny that we can effectively give to these sort of measures, because the committee has no other way of knowing whether or not there is any ongoing utility for the powers. We could, I suppose, in theory, apply to the clerk for an independent advisor to go through each aspect of the legislation and come to an independent view as to whether these powers are still required. But we've not ever considered doing that. It seems to us that if we were to request that sort of resource, we would be better advised to reserve it for some issue where there was actually some controversy. So, in reality, there is no systematic method of review available to the House, despite the form that these bills take. And that's why I raise the question, is there a better way to do this sort of thing? The only way that I can think of in current standing orders that there could be systematic review of the ongoing need for delegated legislation independently of the empowering legislation requiring that there be a sunset clause, or on the making of the order or regulation, the imposition by the relevant minister of a sunset clause, is if the Regulations Review Committee were to undertake an inquiry, as it did in the last Parliament, on the effect of spent legislation. That's certainly a course that would be open to the committee, but it's not one that is usually done. And the question would arise as to whether there'd be the time for that, given that there's an ongoing scrutiny job that's already performed in respect of all existing new delegated legislation. And then there's the complaints jurisdiction, which the committee exercises under standing orders when it receives a concern from a member of the public about the operation of existing regulation. Maybe it's time to have a look at what I understand is the practice in the Commonwealth Parliament in Australia, where all delegated legislation is now given a sunset date. My understanding is that the practice is that there should be regulations in force for 10 years, and it should be a matter for the minister or the department to have to come back and make the case for the ongoing, the carrying on in force of the delegated legislation, so that there is actually a justification advanced in every case for every regulation. Maybe that's a good way to clean up the red books that sit outside in the lobbies, because they do tend to fill up, given our executive's propensity, whoever appears to be in power, to rely on the regulation-making power. Sarah, I made some similar points when Mr Foss made his maiden speech as a minister on the dog control legislation, because that involved the invocation of what's known as the affirmative resolution procedure. That procedure's invoked not only with dog control legislation but with epidemic preparedness. It was contemplated for the Canterbury earthquake orders, but that notion was dropped in favour of the ordinary scrutiny that the Regulations Review Committee can provide. And I said on that occasion, maybe the idea of having to come to the House to get specific pieces of delegated legislation confirmed under that procedure was not a great use of the House's time either. That we had a perfectly good scrutiny committee that could perform this sort of scrutiny away from the time and resources of the House and just report as required. And Sarah, I would have to say that similar logic applies to these annual confirmation and validation bills. They aren't a good use of the House's time and resource. We could be debating much more important substantive legislation, but because this is an annual requirement, we cannot. And I do think when we've got legislation such as the legislation bill that would reform many of these procedures simply languishing on the order paper, it is very timely to think about how we could do a better job here, sir.
I call the Honourable Member Tim McIndoe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's fairly rare for members of this House to have an opportunity to consider in close detail work similar in nature to that undertaken each week by the Regulations Review Select Committee, and I imagine that this debate may make our colleagues very glad of that fact. I doubt whether many New Zealanders will remain glued to their radios or TVs to hear this first reading through to its conclusion. My long-suffering and incredibly loyal mother may prove to be one exception to that statement, but even she, I imagine, will find herself switching channels back to TV1 after the dinner adjournment as her devotion